Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool, and honestly, pretty ambitious. We're going to map out 5,000 years of global economic history. Why? To figure out exactly how we ended up in the hyper-connected world we live in today. It's this incredibly long arc of interconnectedness, packed with shifting empires, crazy technological leaps, and some serious human resilience.
So, when you hear the word globalization, what pops into your head? For most of us, it kind of feels like a super modern concept, right? Like it's an economic system that just popped out of nowhere over the last 50 years, thanks to the internet and modern supply chains. But I want to challenge that assumption, right out of the gate. Is globalization really a modern invention?
Okay, let's dive into this, because the making of our global world actually has a massively long history. Get this, as early as 3000 BCE, you had active coastal trade linking the Indus Valley all the way to West Asia. And for over 1,000 years, people were using these tiny seashells, cowries from the Maldives, as actual currency across China and East Africa. No way, right? By the 7th century, we see disease-carrying germs hitching rides across long distances. Fast forward to the 15th century, and those legendary silk routes were absolutely thriving, knitting together vast regions to exchange silk, gold, and crucially, ideas. Then the world shrank even further in the 16th century, when European sailors finally discovered a sea route across the Western Ocean to the Americas.
You know, one of the most tangible and tasty ways to see this early interconnectedness is literally right on our dinner plates. Everyday foods traveled massive distances and completely reshaped cultures. Take noodles, for instance. They likely traveled west from China to eventually become Italian spaghetti. Even crazier is the impact of crops from the Americas. Things we take for granted today, potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, they were completely unknown to our ancestors before about 5 centuries ago. The humble American potato was a real game changer. It allowed Europe's poor to eat much better and live longer. But of course, that deep reliance brought extreme vulnerability. When a disease wiped out Ireland's potato crop in the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands of people tragically died of starvation.
As sea routes really opened up in the 16th century, the Americas, which had been isolated for millions of years, suddenly entered the global fold. But it's important to understand that the 16th century conquest of the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese wasn't just driven by conventional military firepower. Actually, scratch that, their most powerful weapon was biological. The conquerors brought over germs like smallpox, and because of their long isolation, the original inhabitants had zero immunity. Smallpox spread deep into the continent, moving even ahead of the Europeans themselves, and just completely devastated whole communities. Unlike guns, which you could capture, there was absolutely no defense against these diseases. Section 1. The 19th Century Acceleration: Technology, Trade, and the Dark Side of Growth.
This whole era was fundamentally reshaped by technology, like railways and telegraphs. But let's look at a specific, totally revolutionary leap: the refrigerated ship. Before this invention, live animals were actually shipped all the way from the Americas and Australia to Europe. They took up a ton of space and often died on the journey, which made meat a super rare luxury. But refrigerated ships completely flipped the script. They allowed animals to be slaughtered locally and then shipped frozen, which drastically slashed costs. Cheaper meat meant vital protein was finally added to the diets of the European working class, promoting better living conditions and a lot more social peace back home.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark shadow contrast. While global trade brought a lot of prosperity to Europe, European imperialism brought absolute devastation elsewhere. In the 1890s, Europeans were drawn to Africa's vast land and minerals, but they ran into a shortage of wage labor. Why? Because locals could easily sustain themselves on their own abundant land. But then, infected cattle imported from British Asia triggered a brutal plague known as rinderpest. It wiped out 90% of Africa's cattle. This catastrophic loss totally destroyed local livelihoods, basically forcing Africans into the colonial labor market to work on plantations and in mines just to survive.
And this same global engine was spurring massive labor movements all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of Indian and Chinese laborers migrated under really harsh 5-year indentured contracts, a setup that's often been described as a new system of slavery. Driven by extreme poverty, they worked in mines and on plantations with barely any legal rights. Yet, despite all of that, human resilience really shone through. These workers blended their home traditions with their new surroundings, creating some incredibly vibrant cultural fusions in the Caribbean. For example, the Muharram procession transformed into a riotous carnival called Jose, and entirely new art forms like chutney music were born.
You see, 19th century trade was profoundly two-sided.
Historically, fine Indian cottons were exported to Europe. But as British factories absolutely boomed, they put up tariffs that crushed Indian imports, causing Indian textile exports to steadily collapse. So to survive, India had to shift to exporting raw materials, like raw cotton and indigo. And here's the wild part. Britain grew opium in India specifically to export to China, using those profits to finance their own tea imports. So by exporting raw materials and importing British manufactured goods, India was essentially providing a trade surplus that Britain used to balance out its global trade deficits.
Moving on to Section 2, the Interwar Crisis, Industrial War, and Global Depression.
The First World War was the very first modern industrial war, and the scale of destruction was just unthinkable. 9 million dead, 20 million injured. To put that into perspective, most of those killed were men of working age, effectively wiping out a massive chunk of the able-bodied workforce in Europe. The economic shockwaves were huge. To fund the fighting, Britain had to borrow heavily from the US. This entirely flipped the global financial dynamic on its head, literally transforming the United States from an international debtor into the world's primary international creditor.
Following the war, the U.S. economy absolutely boomed in the 1920s, and it was all driven by mass production. Henry Ford actually pioneered this by adapting the conveyor belt, of all things, from a Chicago slaughterhouse for his car plant. It forced workers to repeat single mechanical tasks at a relentless pace. We're talking cars rolling off the line every 3 minutes. The stress was incredibly high, and workers were burning out and quitting in droves. So, in response, Ford doubled wages to $5 a day. This was a genius move because it meant workers could actually afford the cars they were building, which fueled a massive consumer boom.
But, as we know, this prosperity was incredibly fragile. By 1929, the Great Depression hit, bringing catastrophic economic declines worldwide. As agricultural prices slumped, farmers tried to produce more to make up for it, which just worsened the glut and drove prices down even further. Then, sheer panic set in. The U.S. banking system collapsed under the weight of unpaid loans. By 1933, a staggering 4,000 banks had closed their doors. The boom in consumer prosperity of the 1920s completely evaporated, just like a puff of dust.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how deeply integrated the global economy had become. When U.S. overseas lenders panicked and withdrew their loans, it sent a shockwave across the entire globe, causing the British pound to collapse. Over in India, the impacts were incredibly severe for peasants. In Bengal, the price of raw jute crashed by more than 60%. Peasants fell deep into debt, and this intense rural unrest actually became a major catalyst for Mahatma Gandhi launching the civil disobedience movement in 1931.
Section 3. The Post-War Order. Rebuilding the World Economy.
The Second World War brought even greater destruction. At least 60 million people died. That was about 3% of the entire 1939 world population. And vast numbers of these were civilians killed well outside the battlefields. The economic and social devastation was absolute. But from the ashes of this, economists learned a really vital lesson. An industrial society based on mass production absolutely requires mass consumption, and that means you need high, stable employment. Markets alone just couldn't guarantee this. They realized they needed a resilient, government-guided economic order.
This exact realization led to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The post-war international economic framework was born right here, and it centered around two monumental institutions. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, designed to deal with external deficits, and the World Bank, set up to finance post-war reconstruction. However, it's worth noting that decision-making in these institutions was heavily controlled by Western industrial powers, with the U.S. essentially holding veto rights over key decisions.
Now, the mechanics of this Bretton Woods system relied heavily on fixed exchange rates. Here's how it worked. National currencies, like the Indian rupee, were pegged directly to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. It was a very rigid, predictable system, but it inaugurated an era of unprecedented growth, bringing 2 decades of around 8% annual trade growth and mostly stable, low unemployment prosperity to Western industrial nations and Japan.
But of course, this Western boom didn't reach everyone. Following the war, dozens of former colonies gained independence, but they emerged completely overburdened by poverty. They found themselves under the guidance of international agencies that were still dominated by their former colonial rulers, who also still controlled their vital resources. Realizing they were getting the short end of the stick, these developing nations banded together to form the Group of 77.
They demanded a new international economic order, a fairer system granting them real control over their own natural resources, better prices, and actual access to developed markets.
Section 4. Modern globalization, floating rates, and the rise of Asia. Let's move to the 1970s and see how this builds into the modern era. The rising costs of overseas involvements began to seriously weaken U.S. finances. The dollar simply couldn't maintain its value to gold. And that rigid fixed exchange rate system we just talked about, it collapsed, replaced by floating rates. At the same time, developing nations were forced to borrow from private Western banks, which led to massive debt crises. Facing rising unemployment back home, multinational corporations started desperately hunting for low-wage labor to stay competitive, heavily shifting their production operations over to Asia.
This shift coincided with a massive geopolitical change. China had been largely cut off from the post-war world economy since 1949, but new economic policies officially ended that isolation. Because wages were relatively low there, China became an incredibly attractive destination for foreign investment. This massive relocation of industries stimulated global trade and fundamentally rewired the world's economic geography. Alongside China, countries like India and Brazil underwent rapid economic transformations, essentially creating the incredibly complex, highly integrated supply chains we rely on today.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. Look around you right now. Seriously, think about the device you're using to watch this very explainer. Where was it actually manufactured? The made-in-China electronics sitting in our living rooms, the foods we keep in our kitchens, the clothes on our backs, they aren't just products of the last few decades. They are the direct, cumulative result of a 5,000-year evolution of human interconnectedness, migration, technology, and trade. It's a vast, ongoing story, and I really hope this deep dive leaves you eager to explore it even further. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.